Hello and welcome to Dateline London. Turkey, the pivotal player in the future of the Middle East. Anti-gay stabbings and the killing of a Palestinian child in Israel. And 1 month before the Labour Party elects a new leader. My guests are Guney Yildiz, who's a BBC Turkish specialist. Rachel Shabi, who's a writer who specialises in the Middle East. John Fisher-Burns of the New York Times. And Alex Deane of Conservative Home. Good to see you. A Turkish friend of mine once said to me, if you want to understand my country, you have to look at our neighbours. He means Iran and Iraq and Syria, but also the tradition of enmity with Greece, among other things. Sometimes very difficult relationships. Well, a few years ago, Turkey was seen as a democratic and economic miracle. Now Turkey's economy is slowing and it is fighting both Kurdish separatists in the PKK and ISIS fighters while playing host to hundreds of refugees. How much trouble is Turkey in and why should we care? Let's begin with the question of bombing ISIS. What was it that changed Erdogan's mind on this?
Well, I have to say I agree with your friend's analysis of Turkey and its neighbors. If you ask the Turkish government, they would say that they've been taking on against ISIS since the beginning of this year domestically, and the latest attacks against Turkish security and Turkish civilians created an extra urgency in Turkey dealing with ISIS. But there is some truth to it, but that's just part of the story, because when we saw the response, the military response Turkey was giving against ISIS, if you compare it to the military response Turkey is giving to Kurds in northern Iraq, the PKK, it's very asymmetrical. There was only one airstrike against ISIS in Syria, whereas there are over 400 airstrikes against Kurdish targets in Iraq. So Turkey, on the one hand, attacking ISIS, but also attacking those who are fighting against ISIS.
I think that's the thing that many people just won't get, and it sort of goes to the very heart of the dilemma that we all have, and one of the reasons why it seems to me this is important, which is Turkey dislikes Assad, is bombing ISIS, and is bombing PKK, who are the one lot of people on the ground who really are taking on ISIS, and it seems kind of incomprehensible.
Exactly. I mean, the formula that enemy of my enemy is my friend doesn't work in this. Enemy of my enemy is also my enemy for Turkey. And Turkey's priorities vis-a-vis Syria is like this. Turkey, first and foremost, wants to topple Assad and supports moderate opposition or some Islamist opposition against Assad. And whereas ISIS is fighting mostly against those moderate opposition supported by Turkey or Islamist opposition supported by Turkey. So in that sense, Turkey is against ISIS too. But another important priority is preventing Kurds from gaining foothold in northern Syria. And the airstrikes against ISIS came just like as Kurds were poised to take the last stretch of soil in northern Syria that ISIS was holding. And this came after the Kurds taking over a strategic town on Turkish border, covering a long stretch of area, establishing their self-governance.
Rachel, I mean, I raised the question, why should we care about this? I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, I suspect. One might be that many of those Syrian refugees who come through Turkey, go to Greece, end up trying to get into Britain from Calais. That's a relatively minor point in this. And the other is, it does point up how complicated it is for any government to deal with the so-called Islamic State people and to place their threat, given the mess that much of the rest of the Middle East is in.
I mean, one of the reasons that the battle against Daesh, so-called Islamic State, is so convoluted is because, as we can see with Turkey, different players are using it in a sort of geopolitical sense. You know, they all have a different interest in the game, and they're fighting it with Syrian and Iraqi blood. So with Turkey, of course, sort of geopolitically, Erdogan, you know, he wants to consolidate his election win. He wants to weaken the now popular Kurdish party within Turkey. So the attack can be seen in the context of whipping up the sort of nationalism that, given a re-election, would give him more support. But more importantly, why would the US, why would NATO...
and Turkey being a NATO member.
Being a NATO member, why would it trade Turkey stepping up its involvement against Daesh? Why would it trade that by throwing its allies on the ground, the Kurds who are actually fighting ISIS, under a bus?
And that is a good question. And I just wonder, If you're the British or American public, you may just turn off completely and think it's not our problem, but you may also take the view that do governments really know what they're doing here?
Well, I think we owe some patience and understanding to the position of Turkey. First of all, it needs to be said that Turkey's security, as defined to a large extent, it has to be by the government of Turkey, is extremely important to the West, to us. It's relatively speaking one of the few stable places there is in that region of the world, and it is an ally of ours. As for the choices that they have made in the last few weeks, who can stand up in Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, and say that we have any clearer ideas of how to deal with this than the Turks do? It's an extremely complicated issue. My sense is that we have to look to the long term. I've said it before on this program. I think in the long term we're going to have to rely on the Sunnis of the Middle East, and particularly in Iraq and Syria, to take care of this problem for themselves, as they will. Eventually the Ba'athist element in Syria and in Iraq will, I'm sure, take arms against their current allies, the Islamic zealots, and that will provide us with some sort of pathway to the future, which will involve principally the re-establishment of credible states
because the
in
threat
both
is
countries, both Iraq and Syria.
And they would do so from self-interest, because the real threat is to them, because it's in their areas. Is that?
Yeah, I think we have to remember that this alliance that we currently see between the Baathists, broadly speaking, and the Islamic militants, we've seen before. We saw it in Iraq after the American invasion into Iraq, where the financial firepower and the strategic brains of the insurgency were provided by the Baathists, who were in effect in alliance, although the Americans took some time to understand the nature of that alliance, against the Americans. Eventually, the Baathists, the tribal leaders, decided to ally themselves with the Americans against the zealots. And I think that will come in time. In the meantime, there's going to be a lot of bloodshed.
Alex?
Well, the Turks are concerned first and foremost about their territorial integrity. They're concerned about the future of their country. And the discussion was being had, why would you turn on the Kurds who are actually doing some of the fighting against ISIS? Well, you may find that question answers itself, because they're concerned that the Kurds are endearing themselves to the Americans, and if the Americans are on side with that group that wish to split away and break up Turkey, then they need to try and fix that before, in their terms, before the region sees a grand realignment, as I think it will. And I don't think today's borders are what we're going to see in 10 or 20 years' time. So I agree with some of what John was just saying. I also think it's worth saying about Turkey that they are right when they say Assad's is a bad regime. And of course, we as Western powers were against him before we were sort of for him again. So, they do have half a point there.
Well, we were going to bomb him before we were bombing ISIS.
Exactly. But the other thing to say in semi-defence of Turkey is that whilst they may well be flying many more sorties against the Kurds, and that thing that they're most concerned about for their own purposes, they are allowing the West now for the first time to use facilities within Turkey to strike IS. And that is a very important strategic point. So Incirlik Airport, which the Americans had said for years should be allowed in the sorties that they fly against IS, the Turks have consistently said no. Now they say yes. And to give the context to that, whilst the Americans have been there since the 50s, that's the base that Gary Powers used to fly U-2 missions from, it is a very strong facility, 5,000 fighting men and women, but the Americans weren't able to use it. So they were flying sorties against IS from Iraq, from Kuwait. But instead, they can now fly minutes from the Syrian border, flying time from the Syrian border. Which is
hugely... Just a very final and very narrow point. I mean, David Cameron's talking about doing more in the region. Do you see... I mean, there was a failure to get permission from Parliament to bomb the Assad regime a couple of years ago. Do you see that Parliament being in a different mood now, with a different target in that region, that we may get in the autumn a decision by Parliament to say, yes, you have to do more against Daesh, ISIL, ISIS?
I do not.
I don't see it.
I do not. I think that this remains a second-order issue from the British perspective. That may be wrong, but I don't think that this is going to get actioned on.
I think they better be careful about this bombing, because up till now the Americans and the British have been fortunate that they haven't lost any aircrew. But if we or the Americans lose aircrew over Syria or Iraq, and they end up facing the fate that befell the Jordanian pilot, who was eventually, as I recall, bulldozed or burned to death. Imagine what will happen to public opinion in this country if that should happen. selfish, narrow-minded as it may be, and it's not yet proven, it seems to be far from proven, that the bombing is making any significant difference.
But the bombing will only make a difference. I mean, even if you supported the bombing, which I don't, but even if you did, the operational premise of that is that it's only bolstered by efforts on the ground, and the people doing the efforts on the ground are the Kurds, who have just been...
Yeah, just a final word on this.
It doesn't even make any sense
Guney.
on those terms.
I started by saying also Turkey has been something of an economic miracle in recent years, and also democratically. We don't talk about the army coming into politics in the way that we did in the 70s and so on. That seems to have, fortunately, been a past part of the history.
Exactly. I mean, President Erdogan and his party firmly controls the army, and they have a separate security establishment called Turkish intelligence, which is far more powerful than MI5, MI6 combined together in Turkey. But just to follow up on what John said about the Jordanian pilot, the İncirlik Air Base will also be very important in preventing those kind of issues, because the fact that there couldn't have been reinforcement of
a rescue mission of some sort, because of the distance.
Yeah, because of the distance, which is much narrower now. But I agree with Rachel that İncirlik is very important, but foot soldiers on the ground make much more difference in this type of warfare, because ISIS is waging a semi-guerrilla warfare.
Well, let's move on, because in all the fighting and other horrors taking place in the Middle East, Israel has been proud of its place as a stable democracy, but an attack on a gay rally in Israel, plus another attack in which a Palestinian child was burned to death and his father has also died, have led to a lot of heart-searching within Israel about Jewish religious extremism. And there's a bigger picture too. After the nuclear deal with Iran and anti-Semitic attacks on the rise in Europe, do Israelis feel more vulnerable now than for years? I mean, just first of all, the attack on the gay rally has caused, and of the Palestinian boy, has caused real, I suppose, heart-searching, yes, in Israel.
It has caused heart-searching, but it's very much in the context of, wild weeds, bad apples. So the settler extremists that burnt to death an 18-month-old baby, and his father, Saad Dawabsheh, has just died from his injuries today. That was seen as an extreme and an exceptional act, whereas the reality of the situation is that the occupation and the settlement project, which is the thing that Israel does best, it's the thing that Israel funds the best, is the sort of thing, is exactly the sort of thing that creates and enables and gives impunity to this sort of violence. And it's certainly not the first time that there has been this sort of violence. Even Israeli human rights groups report numerous arson attacks, I think 8 attempts to burn down houses in the last year, hundreds of attacks on churches, on mosques, on fields, on trees, on people. This is nothing new. And there is a culture of impunity within Israel that Israeli settlers are never brought to charge, brought to account.
Do you think that's changing because of this, or will change, and also because of the way in which it's viewed around the world? Because there are those who think Israel has never lacked as many friends as it does now in the past 50 years. And that's a narrative that perhaps one of the few things in this that people tend to agree on.
But I think, the context is that, we're looking at a very right-wing government that is constantly enabling and facilitating the settlement project. So however much it says, and it's called this an act of terror, which is quite unusual to call Jewish violence terrorism, however much it says that, it actually is part of the problem that's fueling this. And I think we have to pan a little bit wider. I mean, I don't really want to get too sort of gruesome about it, but the Gaza war last year, of the 500 children who were killed, dozens of those were babies and toddlers. Some of them were only weeks old. So in some sense, there is a brutality of Israel's policy that on a national level, that sort of killing of children is the price tag.
Where do you see, because you reported in this region for a very, very long time, how do you see this? And in terms of what Washington has done about Iran and the rather poor relations, let's put it that way, between Obama and the present Israeli government, that's a big change.
Well, it is, of course, and it's playing into American politics with both sides currently in the forthcoming presidential election having to reassert their loyalties to the state of Israel. I'm not confident that we're going to see much change because of the support, the friend that they do have, even if some other friends are not so loyal these days, the United States, shows no sign of weakening its support on the one hand, and it seems to me the settler project has gone now so far that reversing it is going to be virtually impossible, and as long as that remains impossible, it's hard to imagine the Palestinians accepting any peace settlement. So I'm not entirely hopeful as to where this is all going to progress.
Where do you see it going?
Well, we've passed over the initial issue that you raised, but I think the conversation was a bit weird because Israel is a beacon of gay rights in a region that systematically represses them. And I think it is important that the person who did the stabbing was a marginalised nutter and not the state that was persecuting homosexuality. And indeed, beyond just the point about the state, the chief rabbis of Israel took out full-page advertisements the next day in the Israeli national newspapers condemning this kind of violence, saying it was un-Jewish and it should never be done. If only other community leaders had that kind of unambiguous approach to the persecution of minorities and the persecution of homosexuals, the persecution of people that disagree with them. So I start from that point of view. I start from the fact that Tel Aviv is one of the world's kind of most thriving LGBT welcome cities in the world, and that this weekend, like every weekend, there will be beach parties in Tel Aviv where gay people from around the world go to enjoy themselves and know that they will be safe. A country that allows gays in the military, a country that protects gay rights in the workplace. I mean, this is, to say the least, unusual in this region. And I don't think we should let the conversation about what was a terrible incident go past without saying that's the norm in Israel. Because people who hate Israel seize on examples like this all the time and say, oh, well, they're just as bad as everywhere else. Actually, it's not true.
Guney?
Well, just to follow up on what Alex said, yes, every society has its extremists, and these attacks carried out by marginal elements. But the problem occurs when you have those extremists find it easy to walk in the mainstream and living in a culture or atmosphere that breeds them. Well, it was really positive to see across the political spectrum, condemnation of both the killing of Palestinian toddler and the gay rights parade there. But we've seen many of those who were condemning these attacks went back to their own old rhetoric of hate just a day after these attacks took place. And there's this administrative detention in place now, which was used against Palestinians. And just to be coherent, those who are against administrative detention of Palestinians should also be against this, maybe. But the culture that's breeding these kind of extremists is still there, and that has to be tackled.
Okay, just I want to move on because we've got one big issue in domestic politics in a few weeks, which is the Labour Party will have a new leader. Will they also have someone who could be our next Prime Minister? Who better to talk about Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister of this country than someone from Conservative home? What do you think?
I think we've been here before on the Conservative side of politics, when after the disastrous defeat of 1997, we cycled through several failed leaders before, with no disrespect meant to those individuals who served their party and sought to serve the country well. And I don't, before we got to a leader that could be electable. And in the same way, I don't doubt the decency and humanity of Jeremy Corbyn and the other contenders in this field. I'm afraid I, for one, don't really see them as contenders for Prime Minister.
Are you surprised at just how he has electrified this campaign? He's got young people joining a political party.
Right.
In general, you're in favour of young people getting involved in politics.
I'm in favour of broad political participation in a way that has been on the decline in this country for some time. We thought mass political movements were more or less dying out. And actually, after the last election, we saw a surge of people joining, especially the parties that did rather badly. So I regard that as good. But I also regard proper parliamentary democracy as good. And my concern, again, no disrespect to Jeremy Corbyn, were he to become leader of the Labour Party, which he may well do at this point, then in Parliament they've got a pretty acute sense of electability in the country. And they've got a system that can produce a leader by one route, that is to say, cleaving to the left and being robustly, tribally left-wing to get yourself elected, that does not mean you're going to get elected in the country necessarily. Rather like we talk sometimes about the GOP race in the States, producing someone who out-Republicans other Republicans and then doesn't appeal to the mainstream. Well, if Corbyn is leader, even if he could hold together a cabinet and go the whole length of a parliament, I cannot see him offering effective opposition. And that is bad for the country as a whole.
Corbyn and Trump, the dream ticket across the Atlantic in 2 years' time.
That's a minefield I'm not going to...
No, I was. But in terms of Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, there are those who point out that if 5%, if they could get a few percentage votes for Labour of those who didn't bother at the last election because they didn't think anybody was worth voting for. They think all parties are the same. If those people could be energised by someone like Jeremy Corbyn, they could win the election.
Well,
that's been pointed out by some of the Labour
What a
Party.
fast-in deal that would be.
Already.
For
Exactly.
every vote that they garner from the left, they're going to lose many, many more in the centre of politics. I think we need to be a bit cautious about this because the recent record of pundits in this country and predicting the outcome of elections is not good. In fact, it's not been good on either side of the Atlantic, and it seems to me far from sure that Corbyn will be elected. If he does, I think it will be a tragedy for the Labour Party in the short term, from which they will no doubt recover. Let's hope that they do.
Rachel?
I mean, it's interesting we keep talking about this centre ground when, you know, it seems to me, you know, who gets to define the centre ground? The right wing who keep shifting it rightwards. Actually, I think the centre ground is a lot more in line with what Corbyn is saying.
You think Corbyn's a centrist?
I do. I think he's taking...
My word.
Relative to the population, he is taking a perspective that's anti-austerity, favours nationalisation of utilities, favours a 50% level of tax, favours investment in major infrastructure projects. That is a position that an overwhelming percentage of the public supports. What I think he's tapping into is something that people are just not understanding, which is that politics has changed. It's changed across Europe. It's changing in the US. People don't want top-down politics anymore. They want bottom-up. They want grassroots. Bernie Sanders in the US, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK are tapping into something that's already happened in Spain and in Greece, which is we are not charismatic public figures, leaders. We are representatives of a movement, and this is what the movement, i.e. people, want us to do. And I think the media commentating around this is just missing a fundamental change in the way people see politics.
Corbyn wants to nationalise our energy utilities at a cost of £145 billion, bigger than the whole budget of our NHS. You think that's a centrist position?
Yeah, the majority of the public actually want renationalisation of utilities, and when you see British Gas awarding themselves a huge bonus while at the same time overcharging us, you can start to see why.
Rachel, you must be taking your readings from an entirely different situation than the one that...
Well, maybe you should read what I read.
Well, tell us what you do read.
There's one point about Rachel was making, which is there have been opinion polls when you ask British people, including Conservatives, about renationalising some industries. It is quite popular. It's a lot more popular. I mean, you're talking about whether you could afford it and so on, but it is quite popular because people think that a lot of those utilities are making money out of the rest of us, and we've got no real control over them.
And just to support Rachel's point, I want to refer to two right-wing politicians. I mean, Boris Johnson in the Conservative Party praising Jeremy Corbyn for standing up for real things, and also Nigel Farage unexpectedly saying that he's, talking about some serious points, and it couldn't be maybe a challenge to UKIP, but it's certainly he has a point there. And also on the other side of the Atlantic, we have, for example, Bernie Sanders kind of characters, obviously. We've
also got a Tea Party movement as well. Yeah. I mean, the big point is have the big parties in this country. We've seen what happened with the SNP in Scotland. That there is a lack of faith in politics as usual, isn't it?
We're not being fair, I think, on the contenders that are seeking to become leader of the Labour Party, because there are, of course, 3 other candidates, and this discussion, just like the acres of ink that have been spilt over it, the acres of newsprint, has all been about Corbyn.
But that's their fault for being so bland and anodyne and not even worthy of comment.
Well,
if they were better, then people would be joining the Labour Party in droves to support them. If they were the centre, they would have a groundswell of support. Why don't they?
You think
Why
Corbyn
don't they?
can win an election?
Why don't those people have the support that he does?
I think you need to look at the last tainted gift of Ed Miliband to the Labour Party, which is the electorate, which will decide who will be the next Labour leader. And surely one thing that is clear is the door was opened wide to what I believe is called entryism, and that there are all manner of people who have joined the Labour Party for the purpose of defeating the Labour Party,
Rachel approves
or frustrating the Labour Party.
Rachel approves of entryism.
I don't think that the vast majority of the people who have joined the Labour Party are either Telegraph readers or, marginal Trotskyists. No, I don't agree with that assessment.
But there may be the margin of victory might be.
If people are inspired to join the Labour Party, that's a great thing. We should be celebrating that. People are getting engaged in politics again.
I'll tell you one thing, to go back to your point about pundits and commentators, if we had had a bet 6 months ago about which party might be facing big splits in the United Kingdom, I'd have said the Conservative Party because of Europe. I mean, it is very surprising.
We still may, of course. And the Parliament saw a rebellion larger than the Prime Minister's 12-seat majority over the issue of Purdah. Relatively obscure point, but can the instruments of the state campaign or talk about Europe during the course of that referendum? He had a much bigger rebellion than his majority. It was only because Labour was supine that it went through.
Let's leave it there. That's it for Dateline London for this week, supine or otherwise. You can comment on the programme on Twitter at Gavin Esler. We're back next week at the same time. Please make a date with Dateline. Goodbye.
I love this tagline. It's good.